Hello and welcome back to another episode of Biblical Unlocked. Today we're going to go through how we should not rush into the next big thing, right? We should not rush into the next development in our lives, but rather we should inherit God's promises by being reformed by His holiness and then walk in His path. People want to sort of rush into things without first, praying, discerning, really meditating upon the scriptures and thinking, is this what I'm meant to be doing right off the bat? And in Joshua chapter 5, we're going to unpack circumcision, Passover, and the manna stopping, and how Joshua's encounter with the command of the Lord's army. And at the end, I'm going to give you one immediate action to help you let God prepare you before you move ahead in this episode of Biblical Unlocks. This show is designed to help build your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get a little bit of context into the chapter. Okay, so Joshua chapter 5 is going to open up with Israel inside the land, but not yet fully settled. And the new generation is circumcised at Gilgal, the Passover is kept, the manna stops, and Joshua meets a mysterious divine commander before Jericho. And the chapter is showing us that before God gives victory, He restores the covenant identity. He recenters memory, and He reminds Joshua that the land here is holy ground. Okay, so let's read verses 1 to 9. The focus here is going to be on circumcision at Gilgal, and my engagement question for you today focused is, why does God stop military momentum for the covenant repair? Verse 1. When all the kings of the Amorites beyond the Jordan to the west and all the kings of the Canaanites by the sea heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the Israelites. Verse 2. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites a second time. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath Haraloth. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the warriors, had died during the journey through the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt. Although all the people who had come out had been circumcised, yet all the people born on the journey through the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the Israelites traveled 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, the warriors who came out of Egypt, perished, not having listened to the voice of the Lord. To them the Lord swore that He would not let them see the land that He had sworn to their ancestors to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So it was their children whom He raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. When the circumcising of all the nation was done, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. The Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt, and so that place is called Gilgal to this day. Alright, so biblical unlock number 1. Why does God command circumcision right when Israel is ready to fight? Because the real battle is not just outside the camp, but it is inside the covenant. We hear this all over the New Testament as well. In Ephesians chapter 5, we hear about this spiritual warfare and how you need to put on the armor of God to fight. In this sense, the new generation had not been circumcised in the wilderness, so before they can take the land, they must be marked again as God's people. And this is not just delaying, right? It is identity before victory. How can you have monumental victories, military victories, without having overcome the spiritual victory within you? Okay, so God refuses to let conquest outrun covenant, and the covenant is the most important thing. Now you may ask, why do we even need a bodily sign? Well, the bodily sign is an outward marker of inward belonging. Now, you'll notice as well that this is a part of the Old Covenant. Christians are not commanded to be circumcised because, obviously, we are a new covenant through Jesus Christ, and the early church reflected about this for Gentiles, whether they should be circumcised and then become Christians, and they deliberated extensively. The early church, they deliberated and they decided, no, Gentiles do not have to be circumcised before entering into the covenant of Christ, because Christ is the new Israel, right? The body of believers, that is the new Israel, and the circumcision, we're now circumcising our hearts as opposed to our external appendages. Okay, and why is the place called Gilgal? Is that important? Of course it is, because Gilgal becomes the memorial of rolled away shame and renewed belonging, right? It's not just a physical ritual, but it's a restored identity. So the reproach of Egypt is removed so that the people can stand as God's covenant community in the land. Okay, now let's read verses 10 to 12. The focus here is going to be the Passover at Gilgal, and the manna is ceasing here. Okay, so we keep the Passover now, and my question to you is, why does the manna, that the food that came from heaven, why does that stop at this very point? Verse 10. While the Israelites were camped in Gilgal, they kept the Passover in the evening on the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes, and roasted grain. The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. Okay, so why does the manna stop? Okay, this is important. But before we go into that, let's go over the Passover part. So why do they celebrate Passover again once they're in the land? Because again, deliverance must be remembered at the point of fulfillment, not just when you're rescued, right? So the first Passover marked escape from Egypt, and this one marks arrival in promise. The same God who brought them out has brought them in. Again, it's reminding us of what had God done for us in our past and how we need to continually remember that into the future, right? So gratitude in this sense should be renewed every season, not only used in crisis, right? So memory belongs in abundance too. And in fact, this is one of the key problems that I see, and I'm even guilty of this. Everyone is guilty of this. When you get what you want, you tend to forget God and think that, I've done all of this on my own and I've achieved all of this on my own and I don't need any help. But when you start doing that, you start to look towards yourself rather than the eternal God who makes all things possible. How grateful should we be that He hasn't lost His patience with us? And the other point here, in verse 12, we see that the manna ceased, right? It stops. Why does the manna stop? Because what we see here is that season of miraculous provision where God provided bread from heaven, right? It stopped at that very point because now ordinary provision is now part of the promise. Because the manna, what did it teach? It taught dependence. The produce of the land is now going to teach stewardship. Different seasons have different goals or different things that need to be understood. God does not keep His people in the same mode forever, right? And we can even read this as spiritual growth, as movement from one form of grace to another, because God, in a sense, is still providing, but He's providing in a different way. And now, what He's expecting of us is different as well. He's not going to physically give us bread from heaven in that sense. Now we have to steward the bread that is already present here, which He already gave as well. And then we see in John chapter 6, verse 35, that Jesus is the true bread from heaven that comes and gives that whoever eats of this bread and drinks from Him has eternal life in Him, right? So this is what is important. Okay, let's read verses 13 to 15 now. The focus here is going to be Joshua meeting the commander of the Lord and of the Lord's army. And my question for you is, who is actually in charge of the conquest? Once, when Joshua was by Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you one of us or one of our adversaries?" He replied, "Neither. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, and he said to him, "What do you command your servant, my lord?" The commander of the army of the Lord said to Joshua, "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. Whoa, we just saw some interesting parallels there. Exodus chapter 3 verse 5, when Moses saw the Lord, he had to take off his sandals because where he's standing is holy ground. Even in Genesis chapter 17. But what's interesting is that who is this commander and why does Joshua have to remove his sandals, right? What he discovers in this very moment is the conquest is not his project. The commander belongs to the Lord, the ground is holy, and Joshua must stop asking whether God is on his side and start asking how he should stand before God. This encounter actually reorders everything. It shows that the land is not owned by Israel, but it is governed by the Holy One And this is a holy encounter and a moment of surrender before mystery. And this is something which is really important, that true leadership begins with worship. You stand before and you are in awe of who God is. Okay, let's see how this chapter fulfills Jesus Christ. In Joshua chapter 5, what does it show us? It shows us that God gives victory. He reforms identity. He ends dependence on old provision, and he brings his servant to worship. What we see in Christ is something even deeper. Jesus calls his people to circumcision, not of the external appendages, but of the heart, to remember redemption at the table and to submit to the Lord who truly commands the battle. Because the commander of the Lord's army reminds us that the kingdom is not ours to seize, but it is God's to give. As we read in Matthew chapter 5 verse 8, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Right? This is brilliant because what does it show? It shows us that Joshua chapter 5 is a call to readiness. God's people must be made clean before they can see and follow rightly. And how are they made clean? They are made clean by walking with God. You don't have to get your life right and then walk with God. You walk with God to get your life right. It's reversed. And that's what's really important. We need to recognize, I'm going to radically trust in God and say, you know what, I'm going to trust you with everything. I know where I stand is holy ground and that you are the true God of Israel, and I'm not going to flippantly disregard you. I'm going to take what you say seriously, the words that are in this book, and see how it radically changes our lives. Okay, let's see how we can apply this chapter. Okay, so how do we make sure that we understand that, we have to stop. We need to take a deep breath, if you will. We need to slow things down. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we have a lot of major decisions that we're going to have to make. But you have to ask yourself, are you being formed by God, or are you being informed by urgency? So, what is that thing that we need to do before we encounter any significant decision in our life? We need to pray. We say, Holy Father, please you look after whatever I'm doing. Okay, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to trust that you have everything under control. I leave it in your hands. I pray for your provision, for your blessing, your guidance. And I pray that you can help me see your perspective. You can help me see things from your view. And this is important because all of a sudden it shifts. Because I'm not being formed by my own urgency. I'm not being rushed into particular actions, but rather I'm slowing down and letting God take over. And in fact, that's when things start to get a little bit more intense in our lives. It's when we take our free will and we use it to the best of our advantage, but then we realize, I should just take a step back and leave everything to God. He's not a sub coming off the bench. He is the main player in our story, and we need to let him take control. Alright, so that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocked. What did we learn? We learned that God pauses that military momentum so that the covenant identity is renewed, that circumcision marks the people again as belonging to the Lord, and remember how circumcision before is different to now because of the old and new covenant, that we are circumcised in our hearts as opposed to anything external. The Passover in the land unites or reunites rescue and fulfillment. The manna ending teaches that God's provision changes. It's not over. It doesn't end in that sense. It changes. And that Joshua learns that he is not the commander, but he is the servant standing on holy ground. Next time we're going to move from holy readiness to the fall of Jericho in Joshua chapter 6. We're going to unpack marching, trumpets, walls, and why obedience sometimes looks absurd before it looks victorious. So that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Otherwise, have a blessed day. And remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.